Hi everyone, thank you. So we're about to make a start with our first panel session of the day, which is based around steel strategy and moving over to decisions. So we've got a great panel lined up. We'll start with a round of introductions, then we've got a couple of slides which will set the scene, and then we'll move on to some questions from the panel, and then we'll open to the floor for some more questions from the public as well. So starting with myself, I'm Ivo Kolchev, Senior Sustainability Manager for McLaren Construction. I've been in the construction field for some years now. I've worked for McLaren Construction for about 2.5, and I was with Lang & Rourke before that. So I have stayed in sort of London market construction, mainly commercial. And if we move over to Bill, do you want to do a quick round of
everybody, thanks Ivo. I'm Bill Firth, I'm General Manager at EMR. We're one of the world's largest mixed metals recycling companies working in the US, Europe, UK. I've been here for 5 years. It's quite interesting reflecting on the journey. We were very active in the steel reuse market. We took a break from that, but we're looking at making tentative steps to come back in to that centre. But I think what's really interesting is the UK steel strategy, I think actually could help reuse as well as actually propelling circular steel at the same time. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Owen.
Good morning, Eoin Bailey. I'm the Innovation Manager and Circular Economy Lead for Seven Steel. We are a steel producer based in Cardiff. We're an EAF steel producer. We actually transform about 1.2 million tonnes of the UK scrap into new steel products by recycling through the EAF in Cardiff. And we also have fabrication businesses that take the steel we produce, cut it, bend it, weld it, and deliver it to construction sites. Predominantly, it's reinforcement steel, so going into reinforcing concrete structures, but we also have sections that we supply into the market for the likes of steel you might see on electricity pylons or secondary structures. We are an EAF recycler, but we're very much part of the wider circularity ecosystem and very much an advocate of utilisation of materials. And hoping to work with everyone to see how we can utilise the steel we have in the UK.
Thank you. Megan?
I'm Megan. I promise this is the last time you'll see me today. I've just been at the round table. I'm an associate at Elliott Wood. I am a structural engineer by trade, but I also work in the sustainability team. I probably should have given this introduction to myself like an hour ago, but it's fine. I work for Elliott Wood. We are if you don't know, we are a structural civil consultancy practice for engineering, and we also have a sustainability team. We've done a couple of really major reuse projects, Duke Street, which was a donor building from GPE, and more recently Giltspurt, which was jacking of steel floors. So as a business, we're very keen to promote reuse steel and apply the experience we've got to help enable it across our clients and projects.
Thank you. Kevin, next.
Kevin Lomas, I'm Business Development and Sustainability Manager for Corton Engineering. We're a steelwork fabricator, so effectively we undertake design, fabrication and installation throughout the construction and infrastructure section, predominantly in the UK, albeit we have done some overseas work. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And then Nick.
So I'm Nick Woodmore, Senior Sustainability Manager at Canary Wharf Group. We develop, build and operate the buildings on the Canary Wharf estate, and I'm very interested personally in circular economy and low embodied carbon, so advocate for steel reuse.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll go through a couple of slides to set the scene. So steel, just going through the 101 basics. Primary steel making, so basic blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace. That accounts for about 70% of our total production. And on paper, the average, let's call it average, carbon factor of that is about 2.5 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of steel. Secondary steel making, that relies exclusively, well not exclusively, predominantly on scrap. And that is the electric arc furnace method of production, which accounts for about 25% globally. It's a fraction, so 1/5 roughly, of the carbon emissions associated with primary steel making. And then we've got reclaimed steel, which we call it negligible at global scale, and it was really interesting to see Celia's slides earlier of how sort of that transpires on UK level, but also how we compare to other countries as well. And it is still up and coming, but very much negligible on a global scale. The reclaimed steel carbon factors are about 50 to 150 kilograms of CO2 per ton of steel, and that varies on how much defabrication and fabrication and transport you have to apply to that. So steel is fascinating because on paper, this is the exact same material. A ton of the exact same material actually comes with a lot of difference and variability. So the same ton of steel can vary about 40 times in terms of carbon emissions. Choosing between them is not really straightforward because just if you looked at these figures, you would say, how about we just scrap primary steel making and we just move over to the low carbon methods of producing steel? Well, it's not actually that easy in reality. There's a couple of problems which are holding us back. So the scrap currently, obviously the EAF route of production relies heavily on scrap. The scrap currently just isn't there, so we do have a bit of a shortage. If we just wanted to switch over to EAF, we can't do that overnight. Sounds great, not feasible. Currently, we cover about 1/3 of the global demand of steel making from scrap. And even if we factor in the potential fact that we will be maturing our circular economy strategy in general, we will be recycling more, we'll have better routes for that to happen, that still caps out at about 50% by 2050. So we still need a steady supply of primary steel making to fit into our delivery in general. The second issue on a more local scale is we're not great at recycling in the UK. So that's been a decision that has transpired over years. It's not a decision that was made overnight to start selling all of our scrap abroad. But currently, it's not looking great because 75 to 80% of the UK steel scrap actually gets sold abroad. So the figure on the right-hand side, it's a bit small, apologies, but basically the top part of the figure tells you where we export our steel to. So Turkey, Egypt, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, they account for probably the vast majority of where our scrap goes. And then some of the European markets, which we compete with in terms of production as well, are there. So France, Spain, Italy also buy some of our scrap. And then the lower part of the graph is a comparison of utilization rates of scrap on national level between us and our rivals. And the UK again is sitting firmly at the top, well, the left of the graph at 25%. And we're beaten by France, almost double, 56% utilization. And then if we start going to the right, we've got Italy and Spain utilizing more than 100%, so closer to 140%, meaning they utilize a vast majority of their scrap. And on top of that, they also import steel from scrap from many markets. And then we've got Turkey sitting at 400%, which means that they utilize the vast majority of their scrap and they import a ton on top of that as well. The issue with that is some of these grids are not fully decarbonized, or they're not decarbonized to the rates where even producing steel in those markets can label it as low carbon. So even if it's EAF, there's quite a big margin. We started this discussion in our first roundtable just now, and I'm sure we'll dive into it in a lot more detail with the panel a bit later on. But going back to these figures that I said, these are averages. So there's quite wide margins for primary steel, there's quite wide margins for EAF steel, there's quite wide margins for reclaimed steel as well. So the fact that it's EAF does not necessarily mean that it's the lowest possible carbon that you can get. So if we said, okay, let's just kill basic oxygen furnaces, let's just switch over to EAF, let's just specify EAF, what happens then? We know that there's a shortage in EAF steel in general, and if we all started specifying EAF today, who actually gets it? And there's no really answer to that. When we make steel decisions, when we start talking about steel decisions, there's many competing factors of what actually is the most important thing. So is it carbon projects on targets, on project level? Are we all swayed because of the recent policy, for example, of UK net zero building standards, to just decarbonise on a project level and call it low carbon? Are we looking at system level change? Are we looking at national and global targets? So net zero 2050, circular economy targets, planning targets as well, which are coming into force as well. So GLA has been doing it for a while now, but there's talks of that expanding beyond London as well. Are we talking about the UK steel strategy? Obviously we are, and we will be talking a lot about it today. We started several discussions and they all inadvertently end up talking about the tariffs coming in as well. So we will cover these in in a bit more information as well. And we haven't even mentioned cost and program pressures, which tend to be the two blockers that we see whenever we start talking about steel decisions on projects. And all of this results in a lot of volatility in the supply chain in general. People are nervous because we don't have cost certainty, we don't have supply certainty, and decisions, unfortunately, tend to make themselves without any active, if we can't define what our strategy looks like, decisions just happen the way they've been happening for the last 50 years. We know the suppliers, we know the steel subcontractors, we know the supply chain, we're comfortable with that. We know the price, even though the price is changing. So decisions tend to happen on the basis of, I did that on my last job, we'll just do it again. And when we start introducing some changes to that, we get a lot of resistance. So without having a strategy in place and just relying on passive decisions, we don't tend to get anywhere. So the point of this panel session today is to start talking about how do we actually define what a strategy is. Steve alluded to that earlier as well. Strategy does not mean a 500-page document which details prescriptively, bullet point by bullet point, exactly what you need to do. But we need to start thinking about, out of these and many other factors as well, what is the driver for you as a company? What is the driver for you on a portfolio level? What is the driver for us on a national and then global level as well? So we'll stop the slides here. We'll come back to our lovely panel. And the first question which I want to ask our panel is, what actually drives decisions on project level now, today? Is it cost? Is it program? Is it carbon? Is it chasing targets on just project level? Are we getting a bit more interaction now with the clients where they want to look at decarbonization across scale? So, and also, if there's several different targets or several different pulls and pushes, for example, what tends to win? Anyone wants to volunteer with the first question to start the discussion?
Happy to go. Yeah, just actually quick audience question here, just picking up on a point that Ivo put up on the screen there. How many tons of steel do you think we exported outside of the UK in 1990? Anybody want to hazard a guess there? Virtually none. So there's been a catastrophic failure within the UK steel industry to actually respond to the amount of material available. So what's happened as a consequence is that the 10 million tonnes of scrap, which is a strategic resource available to us in the UK, that's now gone into a very efficient, but in some ways quite a poor quality export stream, which in many ways is pressurising the situation today. But we're hopeful because we think the UK steel strategy and the circular working groups will actually make some real progress in respect of that. And in terms of the 25%, I think we're down to about 15% now. Mm-hmm. You contrast that with the US, where we also operate. They export no steel scrap. Everything is consumed within EAFs because they've had a structural approach to making steel. Just for us sort of pass on to the rest of the colleagues in terms of projects, I think where we see this is probably slightly from the other way around, so turning the telescope around a little bit here. In terms of steel reuse, recycled steel, retention of material, I think it all starts with the existing asset. And I think we always kind of tend to jump towards what are we going to do on the project, what are we going to bring into the project, without that linkage to actually what do we have available today to us as a structure. So I think from our perspective, procuring reuse, procuring recycled content steel has to start with a conversation about what do we have in front of us today, and then I think we can then become more efficient in terms of how we use the materials.
I think before the designers, developers get involved, I think unfortunately though, we don't start with what we have already. We look at the rebuild plan of works, even the life cycle assessment, all starts with that blank sheet of paper, mm-hmm. and designs for the future, or makes assumptions of how we should design for the future, without really understanding what we already have. We only start to realize what we have when we start to demolish it, and now it's too late when we start from that point. And unfortunately, every project starts with that blank sheet of paper. How we educate our designers, our engineers, is with this linear economic approach. So we need to start looking at it from a different perspective, and the easiest bit is to assess the value of what we already have and look at the utilization value. From a decisions perspective, I'm coming out as a steelmaker. We're kind of from the bottom up looking, because we are traditionally seen as the lowest tier commodity material supplier, and we'll normally get an order for some steel maybe a week, 2 weeks if we're lucky, before it's due to be delivered on site. And the decisions, even though we're being a lot more proactive in engaging with the whole supply chain, and actually we're getting engagement a lot sooner, maybe 2-3 years now before we would normally get it. But the decisions that are made up until that point of order, steel order, is a little bit disjointed, because you could have the top level saying all the right things about decarbonisation, about circularity, whether it's built into a circular economy statement for London. Ultimately, the final decision is down to the last person in the subcontractor or subcontractor that's buying the steel. And they do not care about whatever it is, they just want the cheapest price.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so we can do all the positive things on top, but if on the bottom it's down to one individual who's been measured on getting the cheapest price out of that ton of steel, then it's pointless.
So putting words in your mouth, you're saying that it always comes down to cost, essentially, because that's the last person that makes the decision.
At the moment, yes.
Yeah.
We see that. I think depending who the client is and the sector you're working for, there's obviously different dynamics. Because at project level, you've obviously got clients' aspirations. There may be planning requirements, influence from consultants with their past experience and knowledge. Certainly now we're regularly seeing on projects whole life carbon assessments coming through. And that's quite granular in terms of actually being specific targets for our trade. So obviously that influences choice of material in terms of whether there's a blend of blast furnace, electric arc, steel reuse, possibly look at innovations, maybe some high strength steel, high strength to low weight ratio. The other thing I think that needs to be focused on is once the client sort of had that decision in terms of are they new building, are they refurbing, the repurposing, is the focus on design. To me, that's where you make a lot of the savings before we even think about material procurement. Certainly from a fabricator's point of view, where we have in-house design, when we work with Taylor Woodrow and Waterman's Eco Park in London, which was an energy from waste facility, that was a really collaborative approach, and we were brought into the team a lot earlier than we normally would be. And the dynamics of that, because there was that collaboration, the genuine desire to work together, that project delivered 720 tonnes of ton saving, of hot rolled tonnage saving. So that was saving to the client on price, saving to the projects on embodied carbon, saving on programme, reduced disruption obviously to the local community, less transport on the site. So it's those sort of dynamics, but it's all about the client, the makeup of that team, that sort of focus and that vision for that project. And that is just different on different projects in different sectors.
But that tends to be a lucky alignment of the stars, where you get every single factor in the right direction, and you get a saving, you get a program saving, you get a carbon saving, everyone's on board, you've got early engagements, you've got people engaged. What's your experience, Nick, from client sides with that?
Well, I was going to say, costs and programme, obviously, the sort of top of the tree, and you can't get around that. But then if you have the right sort of specialists in your project team, you have the people advocating for the metrics that we're talking about. So circularity hasn't been mentioned much today in comparison to whole life carbon, because there are views on how steel is sort of interpreted in the whole life carbon analysis. But if you've got the right people, and we have people who do the construction side of projects helping in the early REBA stages, so 1 and 2, we've got people who will be actually building the job with that specialist knowledge, helping to make the right decisions. And we also, just with Canary Wharf's estate, we're really benefiting from good bones in a lot of buildings. So we're actually leaving a lot of material in situ. So I've got 2 projects that have recently gone to planning. The substructure is retained wholesale. So all of that rebar that's in the piles, that's not even touched. And then one's got 95% of the structure retained steel frame, and the other 80% of the structure steel frame retained. So just keeping it in situ, we get the benefit immediately of making those decisions. And then we have to have the push and pull of what metrics are important for then procuring the rest of the steel for the add-ons to improve those buildings.
Yeah. And then we keep talking about early engagements in general. And from a principal contractor point of view, early engagement is really important to us as well. But then we started having these conversations recently of how early is too early, or can you get to a position where you start talking about things too early, they're too abstract, they're too vague, you don't really get anywhere, you leave it for a little bit and then you blink and you've missed the opportunity. So defining how early we actually get engaged to have a meaningful impact, for example, is also quite tricky. And from a structural engineering side of things, Megan, so how early do you, for example, need to start engaging with the rest of the supply chain or with the rest of the design team to start making decisions about reuse, let's say, or decarbonisation of steel in general, if we were to open it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it probably depends on the type of project. I mean, what we see is that, yes, cost and program are massive drivers, but ultimately it's about managing risk across a project. So, you know, if there's a business as usual case where a client understands the procurement method, knows where they're getting the steel from, understands the cash flow and the capital allocation, that's less risky to them, even though there might be a cost and a program saving going down another method. And with financial viability of a lot of projects being quite difficult, you know, I can absolutely understand why clients are a bit hesitant to try something different, because it's all well and fine me as the consultant saying, you know, yay, steel reuse, but, you know, it's not my risk I'm holding at the end of the day. So I think it's management of risk. And in terms of procurement, getting early engagement, I think it really depends. I think if the client has a really strong aspiration for steel reuse, or there's, you know, a combination of factors that are coming together, you know, we think, you know, getting a fabricator early engagement, you know, before you bring the main contractor on, if you're procuring steel from a second-hand, like a stockist. We're at the moment doing some early engagement with demolition contractors before we've gone out to tender. So we're finding, I don't know, maybe say like, you know, with the demo contractors, maybe it's a month or so before tender. And then on the procurement of steel side, I mean, you know, we've had conversations, and that's been, you know, maybe like 6 months to a year, just early conversations happening to figure out, you know, is this reasonable on this job? What do you think you can do? So yeah.
I think there's a thing to be added here on steel specification, because you mentioned decarbonizing steel, and you're not going to be able to do that as a developer. You can decide where you buy your steel, but you can't impact the decarbonization process. That's down to the steelmaker themselves. But there is an education piece perhaps within better understanding the steel industry, and so blast furnace steel, arc furnace steel. And the steel industry itself splits it into two basic types of products in terms of flat products and long products. Now, the steel making, which is the blast furnace steel making, that just produces molten steel, as does the arc furnace process. It produces molten steel. What happens next decides on what product is being produced. Because in flat products, you cast molten steel to the slabs, long products generally into billets. And then you go into the rolling mills, and the rolling mill capabilities and capacity in the UK is very much defined. And so that will tell you exactly what products we can produce in the UK, either on blast furnace or arc furnace. And when you're specifying steel into a project, you need to understand that. You need to understand, particularly if the tariffs are going to force you down the route of utilising UK steel, you need to understand what we produce in the UK. But then you also need to understand what we produce in Europe, because if we don't produce in the UK, you can probably get a lower carbon in Europe, but you need to understand that as well. So there's so much education, I think, still needs to be imparted in the construction sector to understand, particularly if you're going to look at steel more broadly. So I think that's, and then you can add the carbon element onto that as well. We spoke in the panel discussion, or in the breakout group earlier about the difference between EAF steel across the different steel makers and countries, and you showed on your slide, EAF steel from Turkey could have up to 1.6 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, whereas our EPD currently sits at 374 kilograms of CO2. So there's a marked difference between EAF steel by itself.
Yep.
So yeah, there's a lot of nuanced information and knowledge we need to have.
And just picking up on that point as well, so I think the direction of travel for all of us is clear. We are going towards low carbon materials, and the cost of high carbon materials is becoming increasingly more and more important. And on the back of that, the whole piece about dual decarbonisation of steel. It sounds great in practice, and I've seen it. I've seen the term used quite excessively in the UK in general. Question is, from a strategy point of view, are we actually on board with that? Do we support it as clients, structural engineers, fabricators, manufacturers? Do we actually support that idea that we do need to swallow the pill, that we will need to use BOF steel, for example, and there's a scope for that to be reduced in terms of carbon, and also there's a scope to reduce the EAF emissions lower down as well. So what do we think about the dual decarbonisation piece in general?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's I see Will's just walked in the room, which is great. I know myself and Will, we've had lots of, can you leave now, please? No, but I think we have to accept it, Ivo, considering where we are. Steel making, it's not easy, it's not cheap. You know, you've got billions of pounds worth of assets which are already installed, and trying to transition when there's global overcapacity from certain countries and certain manufacturers, trying to transition into EAFs. I mean, Tata's build is about £1.5 billion just to put one electric arc furnace. So I think there has to be a recognition of where we're starting from today. And I think what is really encouraging, though, is that the ability to actually move towards higher quality products really does allow the electric arc furnaces to compete. Owen's got a very well-established electric arc furnace producing products that the UK is utilising. But I think the interesting and exciting space that we see, and it's great that the Labour government have actually come in and grabbed this, to be fair to them, by setting up the various working groups, is that how do we make the best value, how do we make the best products which can help us not only decarbonise but add the value into the UK economy? Because at the minute there's a big market failure. You know, you put up some great numbers about why are we exporting that amount of product from the UK. Yeah. So I think, yeah, we think it's a bit of a clarion call, isn't it? Billions of tons of carbon being emitted. How do we reduce that, and how quickly can we go?
Any other thoughts on that?
I think the challenge is, obviously, with the UK steel strategy coming out, obviously fairly recently, is we obviously already use blast furnace and EAF steel and steel reuse. But obviously now we've obviously got things like net carbon building standards coming in. There's obviously set targets there now for sectors to deliver. It's that transition period where we'll start at least 2 years away from coming on stream. I don't know if British Steel, whether that's under public or private ownership in the future, who knows? If they decide to build, that's at least another 4 or 5 years away. So we've got this like conundrum in terms of we've got these targets, we've got the journey, we've got the Climate Change Act, which come 2050 we're supposed to be, you know, net zero. So it's just managing that transition. And I think some of these strategies and policies don't quite marry up at the moment. And they certainly need a review. And I know from our own association, the BCSA, are doing a lot of work with a lot of other business leaders and industry leaders just to try and sort of review last minute some of those tariffs and quotas that have been bandied around. So it's important for UK PLC, not just construction, that those discussions take place and there's some positive action from them. In the short, medium, long term. I mean, in terms of long term, do we support UK manufacture? 100%. But it can't be at the detriment to the rest of the UK construction industry supply chain. You know, there's designers involved, there's fabricators, there's manufacturers, there's stockists. The list goes on of businesses reliant on that industry. So that needs to be carefully managed over that transition period.
Yeah, and just to put some of that into context as well, so I'm going to shout out a few figures. So total UK demand for fabricated structural steel work is 1.2 million tonnes a year. And out of that, the demand for EAF is 450,000 tonnes. Our capacity currently in the UK is 0. So we do need to be okay with that idea that in the short term, we will be swayed to use BOF.
In 2 years, we'll produce more larger I-beams from EAF in the UK.
Yeah.
2 years? Yeah, 2 years.
I think, from the designer's perspective, all this volatility in the market, I'm starting to see around steel. I know that the government is trying to encourage an increase of 10% more domestic steel, production or, purchasing from within the UK. But, if there's so much uncertainty within the market around the price of steel, well, I can foresee a future where we're being asked by clients to be considering other materials. Why don't we just design in concrete? It's got more certainty. We know it's going to be cheaper. Don't want to mention told not to mention it, but I'll do it anyways. The loopholes that are currently happening, which could also have around fabricated sections, which could also have a massive knock-on effect, for the manufacturing industry. So. It feels like this strategy is needed, but it feels very rushed, and it feels like it's creating a lot of uncertainty in the market, which could actually have the opposite effect in the longer term.
We're slightly, we sit in the middle of this, because while we produce structural elements, sections, elements from EAF, the majority of our market, our product range is for reinforcement. So happily to build everything out of concrete, reinforced concrete is fine.
That's great for you.
But it also gives you the opportunity that's at least some element of reinsurance that if we start looking at the variety of different options that we have available, then you're going to have elements where the steel is coming from the UK. It makes sense to procure UK steel. But yeah, I think the important thing with all of this, it is nuanced. It's not just one or the other. There's so many different variables, so many different things we could do. And I think getting to a point where we have an established or more established steel industry that's protecting UK interests, that is de-risking our supply chains, that is offering more resilience into our supply chains. Like the numbers that Bill has suggested already about, 1990, there was no scrap export because we were utilising it, suggested we had a much broader steel industry capability. And so, again, those variety of products that we had available in the UK were already here. So there's no reason why we can't get back to that. We're already seeing the risks in supply chains and all over the world in terms of different things that are happening. The bit about circularity, which we haven't put into this yet, and we mentioned in the discussions earlier on, we're trying to shoehorn circular solutions or the attempted circular solutions into a linear economy. We need to start looking at this in essence within the context of a circular economy and see what else we can do. And it is about utilization of steel as a resource, and we're not there yet. And we're all battling kind of against each other, and even the steel strategy itself is battling against itself about how we can look at utilization and building circular economy, and it's the economics that we're failing to deliver upon at the moment. And it's once we get to that point where economic structures and systems are supporting us, then we're doing something right.
That's a really good point.
I just wanted to add something that on the British, on the steel strategy is that, you're talking about a circular economy, and one of the things I found really disappointing was that circularity in steel, reused steel was a footnote, and, we will explore the opportunities, there may be something here, but, we're going to have multiple years where we're getting EAF on board and still, 7 million tons of scrap export. So it feels like if they want to rush this strategy out, but just use circularity as maybe we'll think about it later with this big scrap opportunity. It just feels like a missed trick, and they could have done a bit more on that.
I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely agree. Yeah.
I think from a buying standpoint, we're trying to take that balanced view that I was talking about earlier. And if we do have to get some blast furnace steel, we can offset with, if we're talking in carbon terms and we can get sort of tunnel vision on carbon, we can offset it with reclaimed. And perhaps maybe the reclaimed market's going to be more stable in price, and you won't have to think about the tariffs and what that adds. But then we also need to think about the social sides. So I'm part of the ESG department. So the social aspect to this is important, and the transition there and jobs in this country, and those things need to be factored in as well. So we have to try and, there's a lot of variables for a client to take into account.
I think on that point though, I think we're not seeing at the moment, and again, go back to the economics, we're trying to shoehorn all of this into a linear economy. And we're not really addressing the issues of a linear economy. And we're not, therefore, also not seeing the true costs. So you might buy a ton of steel, which from anywhere in the world, it could be £5 a ton cheaper, but the actual costs are now going to increase more. But we're also not measuring the value. And so the value of, like, let's say a ton of steel in the UK is £100. A ton of steel from outside the UK could be £75. I'm making up those numbers, obviously.
I'll buy it.
I was going to say you will.
I'll definitely buy it then.
There'll be a queue with that price. Yeah.
But actually the value, that £25 difference, when you look at the wider value of utilising UK steel, is not being measured. So while you're doing your ESG elements and you're looking at social value, we're not actually measuring that social value, or at least giving it an economic measurement.
We do
Not
get
to the full
we do
extent.
get it in contracts. I mean, it's a good point Nick's made, because there will be those contracts, and again, it depends on client and sector, but there will be a social target requirement, whether that's spend within the local area, regional area. We've had it with UK PLC, if you like, sort of a wider, broader view. Apprentice hours, graduate hours, training development. So those things do come on certain. Again, that's the balance between if we've got to buy or spend certain values within the UK. Again, that's a decision that then we have to support UK
And
business.
that's certainly one of the push and pull elements as well, which we can add to the same graph as well. There's been a lot of arguments made for maintaining obviously the capacity for production of steel in the UK, and a major element of that argument is also the social aspect and the amount of jobs that we're looking at. But just bringing you back to Nick's point as well. So for that transitional period, we will have to do a bit of a hybrid. So how do we move away from that thinking that we just need a silver bullet solution that deals with everything at the same time and just solves all of our issues? Because I think at one point we were oversimplifying things, and we were just flocking over to EAF as the ultimate saviour. That was relatively low carbon. We had a fairly sufficient supply of it and quite a steady supply from Europe as well. There was tariffs in place, so obviously the UK steel strategy now brings these tariffs by about 80%, or the quotas by 80%, and increases the tariffs. So obviously that supply is now significantly reduced or cut in some cases. So how do we move from a design perspective, from a client's buyer's perspective, from a principal contractor perspective, and from manufacturers and fabricators as well, how do we step away from that thinking that we just need one solution?
Just going on that one here, I think you could argue that the UK steel strategy pendulum may have swung too far in terms of trying to preserve the UK primary steel making industry. But when you speak to British Steel, they're actually, for the first time, they've said we've been able to take a breath and look forward in terms of stabilising the business rather than being on life support, which is really difficult. I think in terms of sort of where we go forward from here, I think it's a real clarion call, isn't it? And to say this is going to force decisions to be made now that last week really weren't a factor.
Yep.
So it should be a great time for being in steel reuse, shouldn't it? It should be a great time for designing really cleverly. It should be a great time for retention of structures, and it should be a great time for then making the best use of those materials available to us. So if anything, can the industry respond and innovate through this period of time, because it is facing some real challenges in the transitional period.
I mean, maybe you'll have some thoughts on this, but one of the questions that comes to my mind is around, EAF steel in the UK. We get all the EAFs up and running. All is great. We can specify it within the UK, but energy costs here are still quite high. So could it be competitive in the longer term? Do you think that the UK will have to maintain these tariffs in order to keep just British steel, I don't mean the company, I mean like British produced steel, competitive?
Look, there's no getting away from it. It's ridiculously expensive to produce anything. To utilise UK electricity, it's not competitive at the moment. I think part of the strategy is to try and make it a bit more competitive. I think using some of the tariffs and particularly the carbon border adjustments might kind of level the playing field for certain supplies, because one of our biggest market competitors is Turkey.
Yep.
And we're effectively competing for EAF, high recycled content EAF steel, predominantly for the concrete reinforcement. But they're undercutting us because they don't have the same regulations that we have. They have a subsidized electricity network, which is purely supplied on coal-fired power stations. So they're already inherently a lot more in terms of carbon intensive. But yet we find it harder and harder to compete with them. And in fact, it's impossible to compete with them. So we have to try and do other things to kind of offer what we do. But I think, again, going back, this is back down to education. I think there's a lot more we can do with the resources we have available to us, and actually within Europe, that we're probably not really capitalising on. And I think we wouldn't have any issue with a market being competitive with us based upon the carbon footprint, because then we know that we're all kind of working on the same level. We're all but the other challenge we have is that we also have European friends and neighbours who have electricity network that's subsidised.
Yes.
So yeah, we need to do a lot more in the UK. I think we are trying to, as in the UK government is trying to go that direction, and I think decoupling electricity costings from the natural gas market, that's one of the ways they're trying to do that. Now, whether we'll get there or not, I'm not sure, but there's a lot more we need to do. But yeah, it's
CBAM is a very valid point, because that will probably even out the playing fields a little bit. But again, we come to the same conclusion almost, that carbon costs money bad. So therefore, how do we move away from that, and how do we still sort of achieve all of our targets that we've got about net zero, about the UK net building standards, about local procurements, and keeping all of that in mind?
One of the things we mentioned up in the discussions earlier, when we do we need to start coupling carbon savings with the wider carbon accounting process.
I completely agree with you.
Because we're only measuring the negative emissions of everything we do.
Yep.
Which means there's no incentive to utilise the resource we already have. There's no incentive for reuse. There's no incentive for recycling, and certainly not recycling within the UK market. So we need to incentivise. So when we do our life cycle assessments, when we have our standards, whether they're PAS 2080 or RICS WLCA, that we also need to get the value of the resource, the carbon savings of utilising those resources, because at the moment we don't. And this goes back to the blank sheet of paper analogy, where we're starting from scratch and designing assumptions for the future, as opposed to let's look at the value of what we already have now.
I couldn't agree more on that point, just generally around, particularly, there's a lot of discussion around supply of reused steel. The supply is very low, which means it's minuscule versus like the demand for the UK. And there's no incentive at the moment for our clients to dismantle, deconstruct, and put it back into the stockist, because what benefit do they get for doing that? It just costs them a bit more money, might take a bit longer, and like I said before, with the viability of projects, really difficult. Well, there's no incentive there. But if they were able to get some sort of credit or some sort of incentive through carbon savings, I think that could really start to shift the market into reusing more.
I agree, yeah, and I think we need a more usable metric for how we define that value, that added value from the whole process, because it's going back to the carrot and the stick. Do you incentivize people to do the right thing, or do you penalize them for doing the wrong thing? The carbon offsetting, for example, is an interesting concept. Again, from a principal contractor point of view, we have had discussions with different clients, and they approach it very differently. Again, some would incentivize you going below a carbon target for a project, and would look slightly wider as well of added benefit and added value to their portfolio. Even, for example, if we increase the carbon target for a particular job, if that means that they get some resource back and they can use it somewhere else, that's a win in their books. So they're more likely to be a bit more flexible, for example. But we've also, I have to admit, we've had the opposite, where the contract target is the contract target, because that's tied to green funding, investors, carbon targets upstream. So therefore, it's not even a consideration to stray away from that target, and there's a very strict penalty at the end of that target as well. So it's clear that we need to start redefining how we look at strategy, and how strategies of different companies kind of converge or actually go against each other as well. And from a client's point of view, Nick, how do you sort of see incentivization coming up as a concept in the UK market?
Well, I think just based on some of the inquiries we've had recently, it can become sort of access to the bigger tenants that then justify doing the larger projects. If they've got criteria that they need to meet and they have their own strategies, then you've got to follow suit to provide them the space that they're asking for. But just going back to the previous point, I think you can just give a common sense argument for reuse because it avoids mining, water pollution, like the list goes on, and they're all immediate benefits as opposed to melting. So if you have a section that's reusable and you melt it down to then create another section, that is insane, really, if we look at it in very stark terms. So I think there's ways to get people on boards that's just with the narrative of common sense as much as anything, which maybe doesn't get spoken about as much because we focus on carbon targets so strongly.
How much would you pay for common sense?
But I think it's a really interesting point, Nick, about, I agree with you, this sort of philosophy about materials use and resource efficiency and reuse obviously has tremendous benefits. But there will be some sections that are not the best placed to be reused, and trying to do that is difficult, creates cost and pressure and risk into projects, and that material is a very low residual chemistry that can go into the EAFs coming online in the UK to create the flat and long products that will generate the additional value. So I think sometimes we almost create this false opposition between reuse and recycling.
Okay.
Where it's a resource strategy and I think both will support each other. I think the more reuse we do, the more quality recycling they do, more quality recycling they do. We do the more reuse we do because we're interested in providing chemistry into mills. So, what's the steel in that building? What's the grade? Is it an S35? Is it 275? How does that work into the recipes that Eoin and the rest of the mills want? And with EAFs coming online, they need better quality. So you either source it better or you put a lot of money and effort into processing the mixed materials that come through. So I think there's a conversation that encompasses both there about materials.
If we take it a very, very broad brush and say a third definitely has to go back for recycling, there's a third where it's a maybe, and it might need too much refabrication, and then there's an optimum third. We're not really gauging how much that optimum third is to then target keeping it in the system.
I think with the third that goes for recycling, I think we need to be a lot more transparent about what that means. Yes, all scrap will be recycled somewhere in the world. But at the moment, only about 10-15% is going to be recycled in the UK.
Yeah.
So, you can decide where it's recycled. So if you're a site owner or you're a demolition contractor, you can decide where it goes, to an extent. But there's things we also need. We're kind of backing back into the conversation about true circularity. And I think to get to a point of true circularity and the quality we need through a steel industry that is able to provide the quality of steels that we need for those industries, we need to start looking at material flows and value flows. So that, for example, Tata Steel are producing flat products for the automotive industry. Then the automotive industry should only be supplying their scrap back into that steel manufacturer, and so that at least you have a chance to get the quality of steel to produce the product through an EAF, and at least start to explore what those value streams start to look like. Yep. And I think that's something else we can make those decisions at the end of life, whether it's a building, whether it's a vehicle, or whether it's offshore wind, or whatever the case may be. That there's these opportunities to be able to look at value streams in the future.
And I think, as Bill says as well, that there's this assumption almost that now, especially with the UK steel strategy and the future switch over to EAF and reuse will be competing for scrap for the same material, essentially. And going back to the points that we don't need a silver bullet solution, they need to work hand in hand. And the whole piece has been mentioned several times today about utilisation of steel sections as well. we shouldn't be reusing just for the sake of reusing, and we need to be very smart about that, and for that we rely on structural engineers. So in a lot of cases we need, and some people, for example, clients, principal contractors might be doing it for the wrong thing because they just want to put it on their portfolio that they know how to reuse steel or they have done it before. So that also needs to be a factor in our strategy as a company of how we define reuse and how useful reuse it actually is. But on that as well, are we expecting now from July 1st, for example, when the UK Steel strategy comes in, are we expecting to see people flocking over to reuse, or do we think it will still remain fairly niche and still an uphill battle?
I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier, but the supply of reused steel, you know, we've recently been looking at it, and if you're looking at just Emerald and Cleveland for open sections, so what we're typically using in construction projects, it's about 0.3% of the UK demand for open sections. I could be off on my numbers there, but you know, it's somewhere in that ballpark. Roy, please.
Sounds good.
Please correct me if I'm wrong. Those are just the headline numbers. So I mean, even if everybody flocked to reuse and everyone said, "Oh, we're going to reuse steel now," I mean, supply and demand would dictate that price is going to shoot up as well. So there just isn't the supply at the moment to completely reuse steel, and that's why I mentioned the point earlier where, if it's volatile to use steel generally, I mean, why as a client would you not be thinking about, you know, different materials? You know, going back in might actually be less risky for you at, you know, stage 3, stage 4 to go back into design and actually just redesign it as a concrete frame. And, you know, that's where I think there's a bit of a risk because the supply just isn't there. And where we've got clients who have portfolio level, we're encouraging them to look at their portfolio to reduce that risk of not being able to acquire steel, either new steel or reused steel.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that we might not necessarily compete of EAF versus reuse, but steel versus concrete or something else. Yeah, and just one more question, and then we'll open up to questions from the public, because I'm sure there will be a lot of burning questions as well. We're going to say something? Aaron?
No, I was just going to kind of say that the landscape is changing, that this is probably one step forward. But if we are going to truly embrace the circular economy, you're going to start to see steel makers becoming service providers or service providers doing different types of services. For example, we're exploring the opportunity that we can actually supply steel as a service into certain applications, a bit like scaffolding. The scaffolding beams can be provided as a service solution. There's no reason why certain products can't be supplied and provided in as a service solution. Or even fabricators themselves become service providers in that they design for a particular application and they utilize that application multiple times. So there's so many more opportunities when we start looking at a truly circular economy. And even the idea, and there's something we're floating around at the moment, is that we as a steelmaker become a service provider in terms of we can transform your material. And these sort of ideas are available when you start looking at true circularity, and you're not trying to compete within the context of a linear economy, or at least within the confines of a linear economy.
I think just within that point, in terms of efficiencies and use, obviously we have in-house design, so it gives us a big advantage as well as working with consultants and main contractors. But when we design, part of that focus is the fact that we've got a lot of standard details that have been generated over decades, but also fall into the efficiency of our production facility and how we actually want to install on site, from not just a health and safety perspective, but future deconstruction in terms of bolted connections. So there's probably a lot of efficiencies that fabricators are already building in terms of that circularity, in terms of reducing recycled waste, reducing waste per se throughout that process that's already sort of been up and running for a good many decades.
Yeah, and
really.
it's how we apply it.
Yeah.
It's just thinking differently how we can apply these solutions is a great step forward.
And it helps where if you're in certain sectors, I mean, we do a lot in distribution and logistics, you know, that efficiency sort of model there where you've got that opportunity to replicate similar buildings over and over again, that really drives that efficiency right through every process.
Yeah, it's a fair point, yeah.
Just saying, really, just building really quick on Owen's point, in the US, there is a well-established model of recycling as a service where we work on behalf of the steel manufacturers now.
Right.
So we're not buying materials in and then selling it on the open market. We do that in sometimes, but we'll often contract with the manufacturers where they'll say materials, it'll come back into our network. We'll then process. We don't own it, then it goes back to the mills. And why is that happening in the States? I don't think circular economy is the first and last thing that the Americans will consider, but they've made that efficient. So the economics work in the States to be able to do that. So I think we see some great examples of how we can bring those models over to the UK.
And it's a model that we can definitely replicate. It's just, where do we actually begin with that? So we do have quite a few questions to go through. So starting with the top one, why don't the big steel makers start offering take-back systems, add value through re-warranty on reusable sections and low risk since you want the scrap anyway? Owen, that's got you written all over it.
We do.
You do, yeah, that's an easy one. Yeah, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
What, as I said before, traditionally we're seen as a lowest tier commodity supplier, and when I joined the company, that's what we did. And over time, and it didn't take very much for me, who's not from the steel industry, who's not from the construction sector. I spent a lot of time in the automotive industry, but looking at what we had and how we could apply it in a slightly different way. The fact that we had our own scrap processing capabilities. Now, obviously, that didn't deliver our full demand for scrap. That's why we still work with EMR. But we could utilize that, build it into a system, and then we had the fabrication side of the business that supplied the fabricated structures back to the construction sector. And bizarrely, for some apparent reason, nobody realized that the construction sector produced a lot of scrap. And so we just joined the two ends together, and that's what we're trying to build upon, and also now exploring how we can scale that up and help the industry, the sector, realize that we're part of a system and that we're all part of a supply chain that functions in a way already. So we're not trying to reinvent the system, we're just trying to utilize the system in a slightly different way, and that kind of take-back scheme is always an option. But it means that level of engagement, that perhaps traditionally, because we're so low and considered to be low tier, the decision makers at the top wouldn't necessarily speak to us directly.
Yeah.
So now it's obviously that's possible.
Why don't the big steel makers work? We've had that one. So buildings need to be designed to suit reuse and circularity from the beginning to enable reuse at scale. What would clients need to support this? As the client's representative, Nick, would you like to take that one?
Well, I think steel frames are essentially designed for reuse as it is. We could probably do with better deconstruction methods being developed. Shear studs and getting the beam out of the building without causing major damage to it is one issue. So if there's some sort of quick mechanical methods that can be developed for that would open up reuse quite a lot with the existing stock, so you wouldn't have to necessarily design differently. But I think we're always very open to hearing new ideas. If anyone is thinking of a specific design philosophy to bring, then happy to talk.
I think the other one is that obviously the beauty with steel frame buildings, they allow them to be adapted and extended. So you've got obviously existing built assets. For example, we worked with yourselves on Buckingham Palace Road, the hub. So that was an existing 1980s office development. Additional stories were added. There was some additional strengthening work to certain columns. When you think about the embodied impact of not having to demolish that building and rebuild it, the cost, again, the programme and the impact on local community, those are sort of things that really benefit. So I think steel, that's one of the real beauties of steel, is that ability to be re-extended and extend the life of that asset.
And the flexibility,
really buys into that sort of circularity piece over and above the standard recycle and reuse. So yeah, I think the product ticks a lot of boxes that way. It really delivers that.
And from a design point of view, Megan, what do you need from clients, for example, in the brief almost, for that to be enabled as a reuse opportunity?
I think we all know within the industry how many different competing priorities we're trying to balance at all times. And when sustainability or reuse or circularity is, 5th, 6th, 7th down the list, it goes by the wayside as soon as things get real and you've got to produce and deliver for construction. So I think if it's something that a client is serious about, then they need to really put it up the pecking order in terms of their ambitions and make that clear from the very start. Whether that's a circularity target or a specific material they're looking at and want to reuse. The opportunity on Duke Street was that steel was identified from the very beginning as being a potential for moving from 180 Piccadilly. I'm getting the name, to Aldermary Square, sorry, to 30 Duke Street. That was an aim from the beginning, and then it happened because it fed all the way down through so it needs to happen at the beginning. And I think engineers love a number, so just give us a target, maybe something to aim for. I think helps as well. So just like clarity and ambition.
Focus.
Yeah.
Do we think the UK steel quotas and tariffs will make steel reuse more attractive and viable? We sort of answered this question already, but if somebody wants to one sentence it.
We need to see it play out on a project. It certainly gives me another avenue to advocate for it in simple terms.
And I think for me, I would just add, yes, you probably would, but at the same time, we just need to be thinking holistically of what we actually want to achieve and stop treating reuse as all or nothing. Because even if you just do 2% on your project, that's fine. And that challenge that you mentioned earlier about the 1%, I think we need to really start applying that. The graph that Celia showed earlier as well about the different rates of reuse between the different projects, I think that's super interesting as well to show that everyone's doing their best. And if that's not 100%, still do it because it's still better than the alternative. So I think we need to start looking at the combination of that. So I would hope that steel reuse becomes more viable and attractive. How are we going to meet the UK net zero carbon building standards targets without importing EAF sections and paying a 50% tariff? Is the answer to use concrete or timber? Again, we sort of answered this question already. From a principal contractor point of view, again, it's really, really, really tricky to, even with the best intentions and best design, to hit the targets in that standards. Without EAF, I don't think we can.
Well,
I don't know.
Consultations are happening at the moment on approved document B, which might make timber more difficult to specify as well, right? So
yeah,
it's getting harder and harder. So the short answer in my mind is it's going to be really difficult.
I mean, having crunched numbers regularly on whole life carbon assessments where we've got targets, we won't be achieving it out of that EAF. That's just a fact.
Is it a new build? Whoever asked the question.
Yeah.
Because if it's a refurb,
yeah, possibly different.
Doesn't maybe matter as much.
Yeah.
Certainly new build, yeah. EAF is a requirement to hit those targets.
And the landscape is changing all the time. So this question would have one answer today and a different answer in a year's time. So, yeah.
Yeah, and also the sliding scale of targets in the net zero carbon building standard as well. Obviously, that's expected to be getting more and more strict as we go along. Whether we're already 5 years behind where we should be is another question. But yeah, I think it'll be quite tricky to catch up to where we should be in 2026 or 28, for example, or 2030. Do you think clients are only able to focus on carbon as well as cost, time, quality, and other factors are just too much for them to meaningfully consider? That feels a bit pointed.
Well, depends on the client.
Yeah.
I think if I just talk about us, we look at a lot of different metrics when we're assessing a project. And we have, as I mentioned earlier, specialists involved from very early stages. We have strategies for things like circular economy that we need to service, science-based targets. So there's a range of things. I think I can only say it's horses for courses, really.
Just adding to that, I think Nick's doing this as part of Canary Wharf Group, where I think there's a real focus on, or should be on, not what you want, but what you have. Mm-hmm. You can do that today.
Yep.
And then what you have then can help inform what you want. So, there's and then that comes into the thinking then, because you have the information, you're not reaching for it when you get into project crunch time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole concept of treating your existing assets as a resource instead of just something to get rid of. And I think we still are probably quite far from that mentality of let's look at what we have, let's look at what we can do with it, and then try to marry up that with what we actually need and offer as well.
I think that all of that is definitely worth repeating and repeating and repeating
Yeah.
until we start to see an ability to be able to measure the value of those assets, of those resources, of the utilization of those resources, whether it's steel or anything else we have. Unless we start measuring the savings we can make or the value we have, rather than just looking at the carbon emissions of moving it or processing it, then we're not. We're still just measuring the negative emissions of a linear economy here.
Yeah.
We're not really looking at circularity and measuring the value of circularity.
I think another word that you mentioned earlier was transparency as well, which I really agree with, transparency in the supply chain. I mean, how can you ask a client to meaningfully consider other aspects like biodiversity loss or water use when we don't really know where things are fully coming from and it's very difficult to track? I think transparency within the supply chain and a better way to try and measure that value that we're adding by reusing or sourcing locally or whatever it might be. I think once that becomes easier to do, then I think we'll start seeing other measures or other factors being considered.
The next question. So in the near future, a few years, we will have Tata and Seven Steel both producing some EAF sections in the UK. Short answer, yes. More on that later. Tata Steel will be talking about that as well, with a caveat that they will be producing certain products as well, which Tata could go into a bit more detail.
I think it's worth mentioning now that Tata, Seven Steel, and the guys can clarify me on correct me on this. Tata produce flat products, Seven Steel produce long products. So we're in very different markets in that sense.
Yeah, so it's not a direct competition.
No, we're not competing, but also in terms of for the wider audience to understand the capacity and capability of the UK steel industry, you need to understand the difference between the two.
Exactly. And speaking about open rolled sections, for example, that's not the case just yet. Feel that the onus is on clients to specify carbon targets. Without it, engineers and designers will default to as cheap as possible and not care about reuse. Yes, no?
Hard disagree.
It's not my experience of structural engineers, but
I can at least say from my experience of working in industry, a lot of us care very much about reuse and circular economy, and it, carbon targets. We help clients benchmark those targets, so we help them set those targets. So I kind of disagree, but if someone wants to come and speak to me about that later, feel free.
I think this is probably a good question just to get 10 seconds answer from everyone, just because I think it relates to everyone, and then we'll wrap up and let these people go to lunch. From a principal contractor point of view, I would probably disagree to an extent, because I think everyone has a responsibility to decarbonise. We're just doing it at different stages and different scales as well. It's in everyone's interest to decarbonise. Whether it has more of an effect and whether it lands better when it's in the brief from the clients, it definitely helps, because then you've got everyone on board and you don't need to fight these fights. But we're seeing definitely a shift in London, and we're starting to see it elsewhere as well. If we go down the line quickly.
Clients set the direction of travel. Easy for us to sit here and say be brave, but I think ultimately clients can really help drive the sort of innovation and development.
Clients can set the target, but then you also need to police the supply chain to make sure it happens. It delivers on what it's setting out.
Kevin?
I think clients do that 100%. Government does that, obviously, the Climate Change Act, and business does that, because we've obviously got, most businesses now have their own carbon roadmaps. We've certainly got it. That's certainly fronted by a steering group, which our MD sits on, production director sits on, so, the top of the tree there, and it's not paid lip service to. We've made £3 or £4 million worth of investments over the last 2 years, whether that's switching from things like gas and diesel forklift to electric, whether that's putting PV in, the list rolls on, more efficient machinery. I'm sure other producers and manufacturers in the industry are doing the same thing. So, there's some genuine, tangible deliverables there in terms of having a strategy, but then are you actually going to walk the walk? And equally, we have clients that check on ourselves to sort of say, you need evidence you've actually done some of these things.
I think it's a bit of both, Okay, on that note, thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you very much for the questions. We did run out of time, but if you've got any more questions, if you want to ask them directly to us, come and find us in the break. Thank you very much.
Good job. Well done, Ivo.